So the lesson will be recognizing an unsupported claim. So digging a little deeper, like I said, into that idea about how do you determine when something is unsupported. So very much related to the lesson yesterday in language arts, evaluating the evidence that's presented. It gets tricky. Because people will use stuff that looks quite relevant, and it's going to be up to you to decide whether or not it really does fit with the argument they're making. So let's go ahead and dive in. There we go.
Hey there. Welcome to the lesson on recognizing an unsupported claim. This lesson will teach you to distinguish between unsupported claims and claims grounded in social studies evidence. Have you ever had a friend or family member make a claim that just didn't sound right? One Thanksgiving, back when I was in college, my Uncle Johnny made a dubious claim. Right in the middle of cutting the turkey, my uncle claimed that America's crime rate was higher than it had been in decades. I heard that claim before, and I knew it was wrong. In fact, the U.S. crime rate has been decreasing for many, many years. I even said that much to my uncle. But there's statistics there in American cities where crime has been worsening. I'm no expert on crime statistics, but it sure sounded like he knew what he was talking about. So let's slow down and take this one step at a time. A claim is a statement that something is true. My uncle's claim was that the U.S. crime rate was higher than it had been in decades. To support his claim, my uncle listed cities where certain kinds of crime had worsened over the previous year. In Detroit, Michigan, robberies were up 20% from the previous year. True. In Birmingham, Alabama, car thefts were up 2% from the previous year. True. In Flint, Michigan, homicides were up 10% over the previous year. Again, true. These were all true. It took me a few minutes to see the problem with my uncle's claim. I had to admit, I was a little intimidated by all the facts he was laying down. He seemed so confident in his knowledge that I started to doubt myself. Could it be true? Could my uncle be right? No, I wasn't wrong. Not this time, anyway. My uncle was wrong. You see, his claim was missing a warrant. The warrant's job is to explain how the evidence supports the claim. While it's true that evidence is proof of something, that doesn't mean that just any evidence will do. You need to show how the evidence supports your specific claim. My uncle listed a bunch of facts, but none of those facts had anything to do with the U.S. crime rate overall. Although some types of crimes were worse in some areas of the U.S., crime taken as a whole was still going down across the country. My uncle's reasoning wasn't sound. Here, let's talk about how to spot an unsupported claim.
So it gets complicated. And I think it's funny that he uses the uncle at dinner kind of analogy there to show, it seems like everybody has a crazy uncle that makes wild claims. But you can really mask a claim or the relevance of the evidence by throwing a bunch of data at somebody. And a lot of people use this, politicians use this, called a gish gallop. And they throw a bunch of either claims at you or evidence at you with such so much that you don't really have time to process it. But then if you have a moment to actually slow it down and take a look at it, you realize that all of that evidence is not necessarily relevant, or it's not enough evidence that's directly related. One that comes up a lot right now, since there's debate on gun laws and gun control and everything, and a lot of people who are the pro Second Amendment type, that want as much minimal gun legislation as possible, will look at Chicago. And they'll say, right there, this shows you, in Chicago, there's, a horrible amount of gun-related or gun homicides in the city, and they have incredibly strict gun laws. So it's their proof that gun laws don't work because of the homicide, the number of homicides. And okay, that's worth a discussion. But there are cities where it's far more likely that you're going to get shot than Chicago. And some of those happen to be in very conservative, sort of pro-Second Amendment states. If you look at per capita homicides, there are Texas. Yeah, I mean, there's parts of Texas, certainly. Flint, Michigan, which he mentions here, has a very high per capita murder rate. So by 100,000 people, you're more likely to get shot in a city like Flint, Michigan, or Jackson, Mississippi, or Baltimore, or some other areas. So, it's not enough evidence to point out that there's a lot of murders and they have strict gun laws, right? That doesn't necessarily, it's a pretty weak argument. So that's what we're talking about here is making sure that you have, for starters, relevant evidence that directly connects to that. And that's a perfect example that they use here. You can't make that's the other thing too, is making sure that your claim is specific, right? If he wanted to talk about crime going up in urban areas, he might have a better evidence for that. But just broadly stating the crime rate going up in the United States, and then cherry picking this evidence where he's showing like this city, that city, and that city, that doesn't speak for the entire United States. So you have to be very careful with the evidence you use and the claims that you're making, and make sure that they match.
Let's start by talking about the elements of an argument. The most important element is the claim. The claim is what the argument is trying to argue. Since an argument starts with a claim, you can usually find the claim near the beginning. Sometimes you'll find it at the end. Regardless of where you find it, the elements of an argument logically follow from the claim. Here, let me walk you through how I might construct an argument. I'll point out the elements of an argument as I go along. Let's say I live in a town that has a lot of car accidents at four-way intersections. I want to convince the city council to replace the city's four-way stops with roundabouts. Roundabouts are a lot slower than four-way intersections. Slower speeds could mean fewer accidents, with less severe injuries. So, what's my claim? A claim should be falsifiable. That means it should be something that I can prove true or false. What about roundabouts are safer than four-way stops? That seems simple enough to prove. All I have to do is show that roundabouts are less dangerous than four-way stops. And next, I need evidence, something that will support my claim. Well, if I'm claiming that roundabouts are safer than four-way stops, I need accident data. How often do accidents occur at these types of intersections? How severe are the injuries? How costly is the accident damage? I need data that answer these questions for both types of intersections. Once I have my data, I can use it to back up my claim. I need to explain how and why the data shows that roundabouts are safer than four-way stops. This is the warrant. The warrant explains how the evidence supports the claim. So, what happens if the evidence doesn't support my claim? Well, that means I don't have a warrant. You can't explain the support if the support isn't there, right? I'll go into that in more detail later on. For now, see if you can identify the elements of an argument.
Yeah, so, there's warrants again, and it's just justifying, a justification for the evidence you're using. Is the evidence reasonable, sound, logical that you are using to support whatever claim you're making? That's the warrant. And yeah, so that's the thing too about making a claim. It has to be, this, you may have already talked about this in science, as far as like the scientific method. And the thing about like a scientific experiment is that it has to be repeatable. Somebody can take your research and do it on, they could do that themselves and verify your findings or disagree with them. So with a claim, it has to be the same thing. And I don't know, it might be in the next slide or something. He makes a point about it. You can't say roundabouts are better right? That term better, it's nebulous. In this case, how can you agree or disagree with the idea that a roundabout is better? But if I say a roundabout is safer, right, now I have something that I can actually look at data, and I can refute that claim, or I can agree with that claim. Saying it's better is hard. What exactly does that mean? So you have to be very clear with the claims and the arguments you make.
Which of the following best describes the claim of this argument?
All right, and we're going to see a lot of the same passages and data that we have seen in the past. We saw the price of gold and the housing price index when we did correlation. So we're revisiting that. It's the same information there. So I don't know if we need to really read it all again, but the staff writer for this sort of made up magazine or news site is claiming that there is some that the price of gold and changes in the gold market affects the housing price index. And then I went on a whole spiel about the housing crisis of 2007, 2008. And, that is not enough evidence. It's not enough data. Those are correlations, okay? But they're basically both dependent variables. Gold is not an independent variable that is influencing the housing price index. There's a whole lot of other economic issues at that time causing that. But anyway, so looking at our question, which of the following best describes the claim of this argument? The housing price index is vulnerable to fluctuations in the gold market, right? So that is the claim. Now, right, that's a good claim. You can falsify that claim. You can agree or disagree with it. It's something that you can research, something that you can really target and verify. These other ones, there's a relationship between gold pricing and the housing price index. That's very vague. That's not the purpose of what he was writing. He was making a much bolder claim that there's kind of a direct effect there. There is a relationship between gold pricing and the housing price index because of all the other economic issues that were occurring at the time, but they're not necessarily one affecting the other there. Our second choice, mainstream economists have a habit of ignoring vital economic indicators. He does kind of mention that, but that is not the main claim that he is making. It's just sort of a suggestion that he's making there. And then that last one, the price of gold went up as the housing price index went down. That is what he found in his data. That is more that's really more of the claim and the evidence that he's using. So by and large, the housing price index is vulnerable.
The author presents the data first, then reveals the claim near the end. The author is suggesting that the housing price index is vulnerable to fluctuations in the gold market.
Right. And again, it depends what type of writing it is, the style of the author and everything. Most of the time, and what you will encounter, particularly for testing reasons for the GED, typically they'll make their argument in the introductory paragraph. More times than not, it's usually the last one or two sentences in an introductory paragraph. But again, just a good practice, if you're unsure, once you read the introductory paragraph, you look at the concluding paragraph, the last paragraph, because they will summarize their claim and argument, which is exactly what you're going to do when you write an extended response, is sort of summarize your major claim and then some of the evidence that you used in that closing paragraph, sort of giving an overview of how you came about your claim. There we go.
The first step to supporting a claim is to make a supportable claim. Let's go back to my earlier example, four-way stops versus roundabouts. For my claim, I decided to go with roundabouts are safer than four-way stops.
Here's where he says
That's a good claim because it tells you the standard of comparison, safety.
it.
And it also tells you what I'm comparing, roundabouts versus four-way stops. If I'd gone with a simpler claim, like roundabouts are better, that wouldn't have made for a clear claim. Better than what? And in what way are roundabouts better? For a claim to be supportable, it must be both specific and testable. Evaluating evidence can be tricky too. This first step is to make sure you understand the claim. If you don't understand the claim, you won't be able to tell if the evidence is supporting it. Next, you want to check the evidence using the STAR system. That stands for sufficient, typical, accurate, and relevant. For evidence to be sufficient, there has to be enough of it to prove the claim. How much evidence you need depends on the scope of the claim you're trying to prove. If I tried to prove that one intersection was safer than another intersection, I'd only need data from two specific intersections. But two intersections worth of data wouldn't be enough to prove roundabouts are safer than four-way stops. Evidence should also be typical for its data set. In other words, the evidence you collect shouldn't be something outside of the range of normal. For example, imagine if I tried to prove that roundabouts are safer than four-way stops by only using data from safe roundabouts and unsafe four-way stops. That would skew the results by comparing non-typical data. Intentionally cherry-pick.
Thinking about yesterday when we looked at central tendency, right? Calculating central tendency. That is sort of the same thing. We saw the counties, the table of polling places per county. And there was 4 examples, right? And there was that one county that had 17, I think it was 16 or 17 polling places. So that's an outlier, right? And if you were trying to use that as evidence, that this part of Ohio has plenty of polling places. Just look at, Franklin County or Athens County, whatever it may be. They have 17 polling places. That's an outlier. It is outside the range of what is actually normal. So you have to be careful. You have to look for those things and be aware of it if you're writing to make a claim.
Data is considered dishonest. Speaking of integrity, to ensure accuracy, evidence should come from a reliable source. If I'm looking at accident statistics, for example, you'd expect my data to come from a source like the Department of Transportation. I would be skeptical of evidence that comes from unfamiliar, out-of-date, or non-established sources. Finally, all evidence provided in support of a claim should be relevant to the claim. If the evidence isn't relevant, it isn't support. Remember my Uncle Johnny? He tried to support a claim using data that was only somewhat related. To work as support, evidence must be directly relevant to the claim. Once you've completed your STAR steps, check the warrant. Does the claim even have a warrant? It should. The warrant should explain how the evidence supports the claim. If you can't find a warrant, or if the warrant does a poor job of explaining the evidence, that means the claim is unsupported. Well, that's it for evaluating support. Let's check your learning.
Yeah, and to follow up there, where you get your information from is super, super important. And we talked a little bit about primary and secondary sources. So you try to use as many primary sources as you can for starters. That comes closest to the event. Or if it's something like statistical information, you want to get it from the people that compiled that information. Anything on a .gov site. We might have to talk about this a little bit more down the road as far as information, because there was actually a lesson about this in our previous software. Where do you get reliable information? Statistics from any .gov location, the Census Bureau, and things like that is reliable. You have to be careful where you get things off the internet, and by who. And that is all about evaluating your evidence, right? Who compiled this information? Where did it come from? what process did they use in doing it? Did they have a large enough sample? There's all these questions that you want to ask to ensure that your evidence is bulletproof. And do you have enough evidence is the other thing. I've spent weeks at archives researching my dissertation. I've spent 2 weeks at the Army Heritage Education Center in Pennsylvania, at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. I spent a week in Kansas at the Combined Arms Research Library at the Command and General Staff College, just pouring through, boring stuff and just weeks of it, and looking through all the stuff to find all the data and all the evidence I need to write my dissertation. And the credibility of the author also comes into play here. Who is telling you whatever claim they're making, and are they in fact some type of expert? And I mentioned you don't automatically throw away somebody's claim because they're maybe outside of their expertise, but you want to start being a little bit suspicious, and you want to verify their information to a greater degree. So some of this will become intuitive, and it really should. Anytime somebody makes a claim, even like his uncle making the claim about higher crime rates, you just you become that skeptic. You just ask yourself, is that right? You don't automatically disagree with it, discount it, but you can question it. You can question whatever you come across, but that takes you then doing your own research, and real research, not just watching YouTube videos of some wacko, actually digging deep and using some critical thinking to evaluate things.
Which answer best evaluates the support of this passage's claim?
So this we think let's see, which one is this? Oh, okay. So this is the price of gold guy again. Okay. So which answer best evaluates the support of this passage's claim? So the claim is unsupported. The author didn't offer sufficient evidence, and the claim is unsupported. The author didn't offer sufficient evidence, and failed to provide a warrant, right? He didn't actually justify why the price of gold affects the HPI. He just showed us that it affects the HPI. I mentioned earlier about cherry picking data. So that is cherry picking, but it's not necessarily atypical data. There is a relevance there. There is a correlation. But it's accurate, right? I mean, the information's good. It is how he is using it that's the problem, right? It's unsupported because there's no warrant there. It's like, okay, you showed this correlation between these two. Why, right? You can't just say the price of gold affects the housing price index. I need more. A lot of times that's going to come in additional evidence. This evidence, right? We talked about sometimes a claim doesn't need the evidence is implied. It's going to be very, it's like, it's right there. It's easy to explain why this is supporting, the claim. Sometimes though, you would need an explanation, and this would be a perfect example where you need to explain in some detail why you're making this claim, and he fails to do that here. So it is not justified.
Great job. The author claims that the HPI is vulnerable to fluctuations in the gold market. The author shows correlation, but fails to consider the influence of a third factor. More evidence is needed. The author also doesn't provide a warrant. The evidence does not, as the author claims, speak for itself.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right, and so we're going to, I think, have our practice questions now.
Now it's time to show that you've learned this concept.
All right, so the passages you're going to see, I think the first one is new. It's something that we talked to, well, it came up because it's like a transit issue, the Kurt project or something. I think we were talking about protests before, but this is a different piece. And then there's the other two pieces are on the Salem witch trial that we talked about, and the Eisenhower's farewell speech after his presidency, where he talks about the military-industrial complex. But you'll probably want to review them again. So let's take about 15 minutes, almost up to 1 o'clock there, to work through those passages, take a look at the questions. And I'm here if you want to ask me any questions about those. So go ahead and take some time to work on that on your own, and then we will review afterward. I will stop. No, resume. So the recording just missed my whole spiel on burden of proof. So Nilda's saying B, how inappropriate that a transit system will cause nothing but headaches. And yes, that is correct. So, in this case, we can kind of look at that loaded language. We could look at how, his point of view. This first one doesn't, make a great claim, just saying it should be called the dirt system. We don't know what that means, right? It's certainly saying, okay, it's a bad thing, but we don't have anything really to go on. What he is making a claim is still, kind of troubling. It's problematic because there's nothing like, as far as like it's going to increase traffic, right? There's a claim that you can really support with evidence. It's going to be too costly. That's something else. Something like that would be a much better claim. The third here, why? Because so much traffic will be stuck in the mud once this system is implemented. That's like an analogy. We don't know exactly what that means. And that last claim there, the reason I'm writing is to highlight what's mentioned at the end of the article. There's no claim really there. So yeah, how inappropriate that a transit system will cause nothing but traffic headaches. Yeah, he is basically saying that there's going to be more traffic instead of improving the traffic situation, but there would have been a much better way to state that. He's getting his emotions on top of him, where he's getting a little too passionate about it. Needs to think more logically and reasonably about what he's writing. Okay, which selection best describes the warrant of this argument? So the author doesn't offer a warrant. The author gives some evidence, but doesn't explain support, or doesn't explain the support. Right. So that middle paragraph, he mentions, okay, yeah, it's going to take away lanes. Doesn't necessarily understand, whether or not that will increase traffic. And, the removal of parking, not sure if that's really truly an issue. So he doesn't really address anything in his second paragraph there as to why that's a good, those claims are warranted. Doesn't offer, which one here? Yeah, the author doesn't offer a warrant. The author gives some evidence, but doesn't explain the support. So it's number one. The second one, the author explains how the loss of lanes combined with the lack of parking will cause more traffic. No, he does state that. He doesn't explain why, though. So that is not warranted there. The author suggests that the new transit system will cause more traffic than it will relieve. Again, that's not a warrant. He's not showing why. And then finally, the author doesn't provide any evidence. So the author can't offer a warrant to explain the evidence. He does have a little bit of evidence, but it's not very good evidence. So there's very little support there. Yeah, the author doesn't explain how these factors will be worse for traffic than whatever new features. And that's the other problem. He doesn't actually explain any of the features that the new system will have. So that's also an issue as well. Which of these claims has the least support based on the information within the passage? So the author wasn't politically active before the current project was announced. So which of these claims has the least support based on the information within the passage? So basically looking at those claims, right? CURT is a new transit system intended to alleviate traffic congestion for Carmel Road. Okay, so that's, within the realm of what's in the passage. The author wasn't politically active before the CURT project was announced. We don't have anything, one way or the other about that. So that's, what we're going to go for there. The author is either a local business owner or has close ties to a local business owner. It does show that he has a tie to a local business owner. And then the author is politically active and routinely attends meetings of the city council. It does sound like he's politically active, does sound like he may attend city council meetings. So you have to be careful looking at the question, right? It's asking you which of these claims has the least support based on the information within the passage. So we can't say one way or the other if the author was politically active or not before the CURT project was announced. Right, so he mentions a business owner, seems familiar with using political channels. The author refers to Carmel as already horrendous, suggesting the CURT may be intended to curb Carmel's traffic. So that's all relevant. We have some information there, but as far as his political activity.
You're doing very well. You've got all of the first 3 questions correct.
Now we will go on. Okay, so now back to the Salem witch trials. We read about this earlier. And it is the same passage describing how these girls accused several women of being witches, and then there were hearings in the town, and then eventually people kind of got didn't feel the same way they had before, and a higher court said that it was basically abuse of the law. So here, which answer points to valid evidence in the text in support of this claim? So the city government of Salem legitimized the town folks' fears of witches in Salem. So it's going to be selections 4, 6, and 7. So, thinking about which the city government of Salem legitimized the townsfolk's fears of witches in Salem. So arrest warrants were issued for the witches, for the accused witches. Town leaders set up a special court in Salem. This court tried people accused of witchcraft. So, feeding those fears, this is how Salem, fed into the idea of witches by arresting women, setting up a court, and then trying women, right? That is evidence that supports that claim. Selections 2, 3, and 5, that's actually the girls making the claim. So that has nothing to do with actually the city of Salem, right? That's what preceded, right, the fears. That's what sort of sparked the fears growing, but it was not the response of the city of Salem, which is what we're dealing with. Selections 11, 12, and 13. Oh, don't want to do that. I want to do this. 11, by September, people were less upset about witches. They began to dislike the trials. Some people even spoke out about how the trials were handled. So that's actually moving in the other direction. So fear is lessening, and now they're starting to question what the city is doing, what Salem is doing. So selections 4, 6, and 7 are the right answer. Yeah, legitimize the town folks' fear. So really speaking to what the town did to sort of perpetuate those fears. Okay, so which answer is a warrant explaining how the evidence supports the above claim? The city of Salem abused its authority, right? Okay, so how do we justify that? How do we know what's reasonable here? So a higher court ruled the trials illegal. Okay, so suggesting that Salem abused its authority, right? So, we can make that claim, but how do we justify it? Well, if a higher court ruled the trial is illegal, right, that sounds like an abuse of power then. Option 2 there, since Salem didn't leave the trials to a higher court, Salem abused its authority. No. They may have been within their right, but the higher court is saying that they shouldn't have done that. It wouldn't have mattered if it went on to a higher court. The higher court would not try these women for witchcraft. Third one, since witches aren't real, Salem abused its authority by believing in witchcraft. No, that's kind of weak. There's something that we call teleological ideas, teleological assumptions and claims. This was the 1600s, right? So we can't just dismiss the fact that witchcraft isn't real in 2022 because of our better understanding of science and things of that nature. So immediately just discounting witchcraft, we can do because we have that hindsight. So we have to take into account what's actually happening at the time, right? Context. We talked about context. So we can't just say witches aren't real, so Salem was wrong. That lacks the context of what was happening in that day and age. Yeah, it seems stupid now, but we have to have the context of everything that was happening around that. Same thing happened in the 80s. They called it the Satanic Panic because kids were playing Dungeons and Dragons and listening to Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest. There was this great fear that this type of influence was turning all kids into Satan worshipers. It gained a lot of fervor, and you had Geraldo on TV, talking about it. Oh yeah, Nilda, I was right there in the middle of that. And, it was just, you look at it today and you think, God, that's just so crazy. But people get whipped into a frenzy about something. And I mean, it's coming back around where we keep hearing about Satanists again in the 21st century, 2022. And it's one of those sort of boogeymen that pop up every once in a while. But in the mid 80s, that was huge. And so there was the PMRC, which was the something parents media, something that was headed by Tipper Gore and a Democrat senator. And there was these hearings. They had all these heavy metal bands and stuff show up and have to, do these hearings and everything about the content of their lyrics and all this stuff. It was crazy. And it was called a witch hunt at the time, based on the Salem thing. But I'm getting off track here. But yeah, we can't just say that. We can't just say because witches aren't real, because that lacks the context of the day and age. That last one, by ignoring the ruling of a higher court, Salem abused its authority. That is close, but they didn't necessarily ignore it, right? The higher court ruled that those trials were illegal. So it is higher court ruled the trials were illegal. And then finally, we're moving on to Ike, President Eisenhower. Again, we looked at this one in the past, and it's, oh, wait a minute. Do we have another? Okay, 6. Okay, yeah, 7 and 8. I'm sorry. There is one more. Which of these claims has the least support based on the information within the passage? Okay, so that will be the people of Salem were inclined to believe in witches because most of its citizens were Puritans. We don't have that in there. Certainly, if we had an expanded sort of history of the Salem witch trials, that would be a piece of evidence. We would certainly discuss the puritanical nature of the New England area at the time, which played a part in that, which is why we saw them, in the New England area in Salem. We didn't see them around Jamestown, which was the earlier colony set up, the earlier settlement set up by the British. Because it was more secular. It wasn't a Puritan area like it was here. But in the context of what we have, we don't really hear about the Puritan nature of the folks of Salem. So that we have, and they put that in capital letters, the least support, making sure that you understand the question that you're getting asked. So although, like that first choice, although citizens of Salem were fearful of witches, many of the townsfolk grew to dislike the witch trials. We have support for that, right? That is in the passage. If Salem had done a better job of guessing claims of possession, tragedy might have been avoided. We could see that, right? There was a panic there over witchcraft. That's relevant and justifiable based on the passage. Superstition and paranoia were driving factors behind Salem's decision to hold the Salem witch trial. Also in the passage, right? That is justified, that is warranted there. All of that's relevant. We do not, though, really hear about the citizens, religion. So that's going to be the claim there. Yeah, superstition and paranoia contributed to the hysteria in Salem. There's no indication in this passage that it was due specifically to Salem's choice of religious faith. If we had, like I said, a broader history of the Salem witch trials, we would see that. Now, on to Ike's farewell address. Which selection describes a central claim of Eisenhower's farewell address? So since the military-industrial complex is new and powerful, Americans must beware of its influence. That's the central claim, at least of that portion of his farewell address. I don't know if that was the entire claim, for his farewell address. So that first one there, since a powerful military-industrial complex is necessary, we must accept the loss of certain liberties. No, he is warning us against the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. The second choice, only dedicated military-industrial complex can safeguard against a global misplacement of power. No, he is implying, though, and I think I made this point when we looked at it before, he never says that the military-industrial complex isn't necessary. All right, because he's really one of the guys that was behind setting it up in the first place. But he wants to warn against undue influence that could harm democracy. The military-industrial complex represents an immediate danger to American democracy. No, he's warning down, like this happening in the future, right? It's not something that is happening at the time that he's writing that, or he's giving that speech. So D, right, since the military-industrial complex is new and powerful. And yes, it rapidly grown. And we will talk about that as we finish Essential Ed. And I'll talk about that here in a minute because we don't have that very many lessons left in Essential Ed. Which of these claims has the least support based on the information within the passage? So the correct answer here, Eisenhower sees that the military-industrial complex is a threat to democracy. So even though that, he's making sort of that idea, we really don't have that much support for it. As I mentioned, right, for that second choice, yes, he does say he sees the military-industrial complex as necessary for defense, right? He never says that we shouldn't have it. He's warning us against undue influence. Third, Eisenhower doesn't believe that civil liberties should be taken for granted. He doesn't really say that. That's sort of implied by the idea of keeping an eye on the military-industrial complex. And then lastly, Eisenhower thinks citizens must be vigilant against government overreach. Yes, yeah, he does state that. So the least support actually is that it's a threat to democracy. Yeah, sees the potential for problems within the new military-industrial complex. He doesn't imply that the problems are current, right? This is something that we need to watch. This speech has sort of been manipulated, and of course that term military-industrial complex has been used ever since. And
that's it for the lesson on recognizing it
has sort of snowballed. So when we look at Eisenhower kind of coining that term, a lot of times the nature of his speech has been twisted a little bit, you know. So that's something that has come up, you know, quite a bit here and there. So yeah, as I mentioned, before we finish off here, we're getting kind of close to the end of what are the lessons for Essential Ed. So next week, what we'll do is start doing the review for each section. We'll go through those. I think Rachel basically has done those as she's, you know, gone through the sections. She'll do the review at the end. I just kind of waited to the end because social studies isn't very long and it'll be a good refresher. So probably before the end of the week, we'll get into that. Moving forward with social studies, we're going to get some more practice tests. We're going to get some big time review. And in between there, we're going to get more history. There is a lot of history that does not get covered in Essential Ed that's pretty crucial for the test that you should have some background knowledge on. So we will cover that. Also related to history, civics and government. A lot of stuff that could come up on, you know, voting, you know, how we pass a bill, you know, the separation of powers within the federal government, which I'll discuss as well in the coming weeks as we kind of continue on with social studies. So any questions on recognizing an unsupported claim? Okay, it is something that we hit in several different angles between language arts and social studies. We give this a good amount of attention. Good reason why, because it will show up on your exams in multiple areas. So it's good information to have a good grasp on. All of that, whether it's topics, main ideas, and claims and evidence, all of that is really important for your exam. Okay, so let's take about, it's almost 1:30. Let's just say 1:40. We'll come back for language arts. We're doing more work on commas today. Commas, the workhorse of our sentence. So let's take a break. No questions. I will see you all back for language arts at 1:40. All righty. Bye-bye.